Hello. For those of you just joining, I'm Hannah Fairfield, the New York Times climate editor, and I will be leading a conversation on how women's climate leadership can have the biggest impact. I would like to welcome Omnia Omrani, the COP27 Youth Envoy, and Nonette Royo, Executive Director of the Tenure facility, and Tina Stege, the Climate Envoy for the Government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, here with me on stage tonight. Thank you so much for joining me on this panel. It's an incredibly important lens through which to look at climate issues before us. Women are disproportionately impacted by climate change and are also essential to driving solutions, not just those that address social inequities, but also advancing climate policies necessary for the entire planet. And there is a growing body of research on this. It has been the focus for many organizations like the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society, which is a media partner with the Times. Women are in many ways on the front lines. They are 14 times more likely to die during climate-related disasters, so many of which we have seen just in this past year. 500 million women worldwide are illiterate, about twice as many as men. And these imbalances are also seen on the international stage. At COP26, only 10 of the 140 heads of delegation attending were women, although the gender balance of government delegations to climate negotiations has definitely improved. What I'm excited to talk about today with this excellent panel is where the opportunity to address these gaps are, and most essentially, where those opportunities can be scaled in order to ensure powerful women leadership in climate issues in the year ahead of us. I'm going to start with Tina because she's unfortunately not going to be able to stay with us for the whole panel. So Tina, what makes women leaders from small island developing states like the Marshall Islands such a powerful force in climate diplomacy today?
First of all, thank you, Hannah, and thank you to the New York Times for making space for our voices and really bringing us to the center of the conversation. I think that's really a first step that everyone has to take. I spent some time thinking about this question, and I just come back to, and I think it's what we all need to do, you go back to your roots. And for me, in the country that I'm from, which is a low-lying atoll nation, so we are at most 2 meters above sea level at any point, which is about 8 feet American. So for us, things, climate change as a whole, but in particular sea level rise, are, one might say, overwhelming challenges if you look at them on the face of it. But I come from a country and a culture that has for a very long time lived in a state of, one might say, vulnerability. Atolls are very small pieces of land surrounded by enormous enormous swaths of ocean. And it's an environment that requires ingenuity and innovation, community and collaboration in order to be able to thrive. And we've been able to do that in my islands for the last 2,000 years. And we've built a culture that really actually centers women. It's a matrilineal culture. I grew up with my grandmother as the head of our clan and the final word on any decisions with regard to the land for our clan. I grew up with a mother who went away from the islands to get an education at a time when there were no airplanes. She was taking boats. She came all the way to the US. She got a college education. She came back. She was a principal of my elementary school. And then she went on to be Secretary of Education when I started my career, and we actually got our master's the same year. So I had a lot of examples as a young person. But it went beyond that because you may not know this, but nuclear tests were a fact of life in the Marshall Islands in the 40s and 50s. The United States conducted a nuclear testing program. And as I was growing up, we were grappling with that, and we continue to grapple with that. And many of those dear to me were on the front lines of that, and speaking truth to power. And I've talked about her before, but my cousin, Darlene K. Johnson, was a young woman, she's now passed from cancer, who spoke up at a time when there was a real veil of secrecy around the nuclear testing and what had been done, and spoke very specifically about the impacts on women's reproductive rights in a culture where that is actually not something that would normally be spoken about. So she went beyond. You're grounded in your culture, but you use it to be strong and to go beyond. And I saw that, and she was advocating, speaking truth to power, and I started my career working on nuclear issues. And so it was a very smooth transition into the climate space. And I mean, I've continued to be surrounded by strong women, but strong men as well. We have Tony DeBroom, who was a huge voice in the climate world, and a big part of the reason 1.5 is in the Paris Agreement. The Marshall Islands, I'm very proud of the role we've played to advocate alongside other islands, but bringing that advocacy background that we come with, and that very strong understanding of what it means to be vulnerable but not to accept victimization or victimhood, and to actually use that vulnerability to understand what needs to be done and to connect with others who are experiencing the same vulnerability. I think that that is what the Marshall Islands brings to the conversation. And in the next, now that I'm doing this job, I draw on that, but then I also continue to meet and be inspired by particularly young people who, at least in the Marshall Islands, we almost take those young people who are advocating and make sure that they have the knowledge and the capacity to be part of the conversation at the tables, at the negotiating tables. And so in 2015, Selena Leem, who was the youngest delegate at COP, was on our delegation. She gave the closing speech in 2015, sitting next to Tony, who gave her the mic. I mean, it's very simple. He gave her the mic. He invited her to come. He asked her to shadow him, and then at the end, he gave her the mic. And I just try to live up to that example. So we look for every opportunity that we can to make sure that not only are young people on our delegation, not just from the Marshalls, but from other parts of the Pacific, if they can't get on a delegation for other reasons, they're welcome to join ours. We partner with 350 Pacific, which is part of 350, the larger organization. And we just do everything we can to ensure that actually those advocates become part of the diplomatic and policy and other types of solutions that we need for responding to the climate crisis.
The passing of the mic that you just described, it's a really significant phrase. I think it's a really powerful phrase. And it's a really good example of a real sort of success here. Are there other sort of moments of success that you can think of, either in diplomatic circles, from the Marshall Islands, that are really applicable, scalable for others to use as models, like passing a mic?
I'm actually, we were just talking before we came in. I just came from another event called, which is being hosted by the Italians, which is Youth for Climate, and it's bringing together 150 young people to talk about solutions that they're implementing in their countries. And I've been part of that effort since it began in 2019. And I think that that's a really strong example of the ways that you can have partnerships around solutions and around ways of sharing and communicating. It's what the Marshall Islands tries to do in our work through the High Ambition Coalition, which was started just back before Paris by Tony, and we've continued to chair. And it's essentially a group within the negotiation process that brings together a very diverse group of member states. You've got small island developing states, you've got countries from Africa, some of them the least developed countries. You have on the developed side, you have the United States and the EU. And we try to, through the hack, create a space where all those countries who are so different in size, in wealth, and in background, to have a conversation where they can actually hear each other. Because that doesn't often, that can get lost very, very quickly in a negotiating context. They call it negotiations, but it's really doubling down on your positions and it's defending. And there's a time and place for that, but in order to make progress in this crisis where we're all vulnerable and we all need to move forward, you have to have what I think the Marshall Islands understands well, being from if you're on a tiny island with no other place to go, consensus and collaboration and bridge building become very, very key to survival. And so that's what the Marshall Islands does. And I think it's important that, we all go into this with that idea. And I heard from the speaker just before us, talking about the need to communicate, to connect, and to look for solutions together. Because there's no way, we're not gonna solve this. No one's gonna solve this alone. And we're all in it together. We have to be. And I just want to end by saying I'm so sorry that I have to leave early because I really want to hear from my colleagues. But I thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you for
Thank
you for being here. Nonette, you lead an organization called the Tenure Facility, focusing on securing land and forest rights for indigenous peoples and local communities across Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Can you share with us examples of how women's leadership in resource management has influenced positive climate action?
Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. The examples I would cite is from our partnerships in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Before that, I would just emphasize that our organization, the Tenure Facility, works closely with indigenous peoples and local community groups who are managing and are implanted in the last remaining natural ecosystems that we have. 2/3 of it forests, 370 million of them protecting our biodiversity. We work with the entry point of land rights, so that's why we call ourselves Tenure Facility. And the confidence that the women, indigenous women, local community women, have achieved and gained when their land rights are secure are very palpable and very obvious when they make these decisions on land use change, especially protecting watersheds, protecting herbs and medicines, planting more trees, especially those that they really need, not only for their food, but also for firewood, for some really basic needs. And these decisions are collectively made. Generally, the women, very vulnerable as they are, find strength in togetherness, especially in territories and communities where they can still band together and make those decisions and assert themselves. So our examples in Liberia, for example, their decision, women's groups, women's land management groups have replanted a lot more forests in their territories, now going up to 600,000 hectares, for example. In Indonesia, a lot of the indigenous women and local community women banding with farmer women have worked together to make sure that the boundaries by which their forest begins and their community ends are reforested, and their medicines and other crops that are necessary for their survival are replanted. They're protecting, and they're actually very proactive in defending their territories, that putting their own lives at risk. And several of the women, and one got a Goldman Prize award for standing and protecting their territory and winning it, you know. And that's just men are there, but the women have a different force when they band together. And a big part of their concern is really securing homes, securing community, and then securing what enables them to survive. And that really hits the core of all social movements. And so that's why they're very strong in that way.
Omnia, as the COP27 youth envoy, you've likely seen many examples of women as agents of change in the climate arena. What are some that stand out to you as incredibly powerful?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. That's the first thing. And so as the first ever, this is the first time that the COP presidency decides to have a position for a young person to represent the voices and the concrete actions that young people and experts lead, and feed it directly into the work of the presidency, which is responsible for all the negotiation and the policy-making process of climate change. And my journey in climate change started when I was a second-year medical student, and that was 7 years ago. And I remember I attended my first ever COP, that was in Katowice in Poland. And I was so inspired by the amount of young people who were passionate about climate change, but we all come from diverse disciplines, and I was the only health person there. And then this really motivated me to dedicate most of my time, what I have left as a medical student, to advocating for climate change, because I started believing that my duty and my moral obligation as a medical student and currently as a doctor does not just lie towards the patient, it lies towards the community, which depends on the health of the environment, which sustains us, as climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And this led me to apply and become the head of my own organization's delegation to the climate change conference that took place in Madrid, that was COP25. And on that occasion, I was representing over 1.3 million students from 133 countries, really emphasizing the importance of placing health, the health of young people, at the heart of the climate negotiations. And it's not just about adaptation or mitigation, it's about the health, future and prosperity of all the generations. And this gave me the incredible opportunity to work and meet young leaders, especially women and girls from around the world, and see what they do on a local level. I worked with the World Health Organization, with UNICEF, with women leaders for planetary health, and through that, I made a lot of friends. So one of them is Marianne. She's a young woman from Uganda, and she started her own social enterprise that builds the capacity of young women and girls in climate tech solutions, where she brings in experts so that they can increase their competency, which A, empowers them, B, provides them the opportunity to apply for high-end green jobs so that they can support their families and also their community. And then I met another friend who's actually from Egypt. She's a young architect, very passionate about green buildings. And together she worked with women in different villages all over Egypt, where they built rural houses that are affordable, sustainable, saves water, energy, as well as helps the farmers adapt to the increasing temperature and heat. And then another really close friend of mine I met in another organization that I worked with, she's from Guatemala, and she and a group of 5 women, they have their own mealworm farm, which basically produces larvae, and this larva turns into flour. So it's a way of really working and bringing in the bigger context of planetary health, which is how human health and the health of the planet can interlink together, and how it's multidisciplinary in every way. And this really inspired me to pursue and to be active in the climate space, which led to being involved in the presidency as the first ever COP Envoy for youth.
So in order to build to a lot of what you just described, education is incredibly important. So Nonette, a question for you. How do we tackle access to education, and how does that have a meaningful impact on these climate issues?
It's a question that is very much in the heart of many communities that we have worked with. And first, there is education about the culture and traditional knowledge that happens, and it becomes embedded in groups of communities, indigenous peoples. And then there is this other education that they also desire and want to access, and that is the education that allows them to understand the world, to bridge science with their direct experience of what's observing, interacting with nature, and that is harder, especially for remote communities. So there have been many innovative ideas turned to action on this in many places that we work with. And there are some even indigenous people's schools now that have, since we started, it was just 10 and now it's 35, where youth, especially led by youth, they make their case where they return back to their home and bring what they've learned and transform that and educate the others that don't have access to that education, and integrate that with traditional knowledge. So there's bringing it closer, meaning conventional education closer to the villagers that are less able to access it, and then enabling the valuing of traditional knowledge in that process. And this has now become even further. The Ministry of Education in Indonesia, for example, has been very open and had essentially recognized these types of initiatives and raised it as an option for many of the remote communities. Yeah.
Related, I also really wanted to ask about finance. Now, the session after this is entirely focused on finance. But I'm really interested in learning a little bit more about the kinds of ways that finance can be used towards these goals, what ways that climate finance can be a pathway for women to have a seat at the table in climate policy negotiating and in decision making.
Yes, if we remember, COP26 had a very big pledge, right, for nature-based solutions. And the pledge really was to give access to communities, give finance access to communities who are the guardians and stewards of nature for nature-based solutions. Now, the experience has been that financing, especially community groups, is not it's only 1% of the current development financing so far by a combined assessment, not just of multilateral, bilateral, but also private philanthropy. Now that is shifting. And the question about trusting communities and women within communities to manage their resources is what we are facing right now. And it's unbelievable the amount of initiative that has emerged because the opportunity has opened. Triggered by the pledge, but even prior to that, the experiences have been that initiatives that are more innovative, that are from the ground up, that are clustered around trust, especially by women and young people emerging and learning from women, is amazing. So I've seen how it has now gone to a point of informing some of the systems that we are building to repipe, if you look at essentially the flow of funding. A huge part of our challenge is there are well-meaning intermediaries and NGOs that want to do this, but as a result of their good intentions, some aspects are missed on empowering the ground up, listening much more to what the communities really prefer, and then building the building blocks for that to happen and continue and sustain. But that's now the shift. We're seeing that.
What are some of the solutions? What are some of the ways that we can see the sort of pathways opening if in fact there's some potential blockades? They're really, have you seen good examples of that, or are we still in the kind of bad example phase?
Yeah, it's essentially there are two ways to look at this. It's the source of funding is generally from philanthropy or development assistance, right? And they have systems. And then the recipients and beneficiaries, on the other hand, are a range of actors, but what we are trying to talk about here are the communities and the women, right? They're the ultimate beneficiaries. Now, they now have risen to the point of saying, don't call us beneficiaries, we are partners. So one key solution is to look at it from the point of view of partnership. And when you look at it from a partnership lens, you look at institutions, you look at capacity, you look at essentially access and education, and then make sure there's equity. Decision-making is shared also by not just men, women, and young people, and others, right? So now the infrastructure to create the response from the bottom up and the systems that are being criticized by many advocates looking at making finance, especially climate finance, more accessible, is also responding. So there have been statements from USAID, there have been statements from the Norwegians, the Europeans. They're saying, like, we are going to be fit for purpose. There's been a study, and they're going to launch by the Rights and Resources Initiative in COP27 an assessment of an accountability of the pledge, for example, and what are the gaps, what are the opportunities. So there's a response from this side, and there is a response definitely from the side of the communities. Here, just around the climate negotiations, you can see many indigenous peoples have sessions talking about their climate finance and how they imagine this and what's the vision. And they're launching this, so they're here. Thank you.
There are going to be lots of discussions about this at COP27. So thinking about what we're looking forward to, Omnia, COP27 is in your home country of Egypt, and what are you hoping to see in terms of women's presence and progress and leadership? What are your priorities at COP27?
Yes, so when we talk about COP27, we say that it is a very critical COP because now it's the time to move from pledges to implementation. And why do we say that? Because countries that are part of the Paris Agreement have already submitted their national climate plans and their commitments. And now this year, it's the time to ask them about the implementation. Did they follow on their promises? How did they do that? What are the gaps? What can we increase? Do you need to, increase your ambition? And this really cross-cuts the gender as well as the youth agenda, because we have seen how in the UNFCCC and in the climate space, at first there was a distinct lack of gender representation, both in terms of how women are disproportionately impacted by climate change, as you've mentioned, because of the extreme weather events, but also because of the socially entrenched differences in the roles and the responsibilities. More women also have higher mortalities and morbidities because of, for example, indoor air pollution. That's another important fact. And at the same time, when we look at women in leadership positions in climate delegations, we still see progress, but not enough. We do not see 100 out of the 200 heads of delegations at COP women, and this needs to change. And what are we doing from the presidency side? Because we believe that in this COP, which is happening also in Africa in the first time in 6 years, and we really want to emphasize not just climate ambition, but we want to emphasize climate justice. And we want to emphasize the importance of not just stepping up the ambition, but building climate resilience. We've seen last year in COP26 a great achievements and commitments when it comes to mitigation, but we still see a lack of commitment, investment, and prioritization of climate adaptation and really building the resilience of the communities that continue to suffer most, even though they contribute the least. And this also applies to us as women, us as young people, as indigenous communities. Our voices are still underrepresented, and we need this COP to have a transformative shift in the way our voices are represented and our needs are being integrated in the heart of the climate negotiations. So what are we doing about this? So first of all, we have the NDCs or the national climate plans that are being submitted. We still say that we want to have more gender responsive, but we want to challenge the status quo and go beyond just being responsive, but being transformative. When we are designing the NDCs, we need to make sure that the research and the evidence that we are using, is it gender sensitive? Is it gender led as well? Where do we bring the science that really helps countries design their own national climate plans? And now we have submitted that, but we are now in the process of evaluating that. There is a very important process that is led by the UN. It's called the Global Stocktake. It's still not being known or aware by many people, even though it's such a very important entry point for all different organizations, societies, and communities to submit their voices and say whether their countries are doing good enough on their NDCs or not. And then the second thing we're also working on from the presidency side is the Gender Day, which is a day committed at COP to all, and we are going to have our own sessions, both at all the zones of COP, but we are also really advocating for all the different countries, the different pavilions, the different side events on that day to focus on not just the needs and the challenges that women and young girls face for climate change, but what are the solutions that they are building on the ground? How can we scale up the solutions going from local to global, but also how can we translate the grassroots actions, the groundbreaking solutions into the policymaking process of the climate agenda? There's also a work program, it's called the Lima Work Program on Gender, and right now this COP is about how can we have concrete actions that would serve the program that has already been adopted back in COP25 and then being reported on in COP26 and now in COP27, thinking about how to bring in concrete steps. But it's also important to acknowledge that it's not about COP, it's about what happens before COP, during COP, and at COP. All the discussions that are being held at this global climate fora, it is on us as young people and as the community and as a society to hold our governments accountable, to ask for transparency, but also to ask for co-creation when we are doing implementation steps in our own countries and our homes.
I would love for you to have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. So I think, are there microphones? I hope so. All right, so we've got a microphone there, and we've got a question here, and a big space between them. We've got a closer mic. Fantastic.
Hello, I'm Fred Sullivan, Executive Director of Man Up Campaign to engage youth, stopping gender-based violence around the world. I'm also on Finance for Development Committee, NGO Finance for Development Committee at the UN. So one of the things that's coming up in this COPs is potentially damages, loss and damages compensation. And then also there was in the last more opportunity for climate markets and natural adaptation funding. So what models in governance have you seen and structures to ensure that both some of the funding is going to actually reach the grassroots, that will allow gender mainstreaming and allow these voices to be implemented? And also, the jurisdictions, especially like the indigenous jurisdictions, how are they accounted for, and how will money flow into these indigenous jurisdictions, especially territories that aren't nation states, going to be considered?
Great question. I'm glad we got to touch on it in one of our questions, but would one of you like to sort of underline that a little bit?
Okay. Yes, so that's a great question. And this brings me to, the biggest challenge that we have right now for this COP is that so far when it comes to adaptation and loss and damage, less than 2% of climate finance, especially from the private sector, is allocated to adaptation and loss and damage, which means that we have the challenge of mobilizing the finance needed for loss and damage and adaptation versus the mitigation, which already has a lot of attention both from governments as well as private sector, philanthropies, grantors, and so on. But to your question specifically, if we were to mobilize the finance needed for adaptation and loss and damage, how can we ensure that it would reach the grassroots movements? And this is a question that we had an event for yesterday where we had a youth activists and movement building with grantors, saying how can we bridge the gap? And this means that grant funding organizations in the private sector need to work together with young leaders. And it does not have to be through one-off events. It has to be a sustainable, consistent, and formal platform or mechanism. One example to how can we do that, and I'm personally part of a youth sounding board, which advises for 2 years the European Commission and the plans that they do and the investments related to external partnerships with countries around the world. So having a youth sounding board or having a formal advisory board within the private sector, within governments, that caters and really builds in the demands and the grassroots needs of climate movements and grassroots organizations in a sustainable way. This is a good example of getting the funding to those who need it and according to their priorities as well.
I would just like to add a bit that it's important to understand that as the funding channels, it's important to understand that there is a meeting point. There are results that are already accomplished on the ground, protecting forests, and large territories that are being managed that could generate the resources that's needed to sustain it. Because we come in and look at not just short-term funding, not 5 years, but longer term, in fact, intergenerational, for the planet to shift. And it's important to see it from all sides. Everyone contributes and everyone has a role. And the resources just found around forest, what can that generate? How will the governance of that be structured in such a way that it continues? So it does not just fund projects. These are lifetimes. So that's really the one that's being tackled now by many, many actors, indigenous peoples, for example. Yeah.
We've got time for just one more question. Right next to you. Yep, we got it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Zoraida. I'm actually an artist speaking on a panel later. And I was just wondering, within this conversation about women and climate leadership, thinking about COP27 in particular, where is the space for non-binary and genderqueer folks? This is feeling, sometimes I just worry that the conversation is becoming very heteronormative, and kind of, where's the space for everyone to be included in these conversations?
Great question. I think Omnia, you had touched on it just a little bit earlier in one of your questions. If you want to.
I'd love to. I think it's very important, and that's why we, right now we are trying to change the narrative when we think about when we talk about climate change or climate action, and bring in the lens of justice. Because climate justice in all its forms, one of them, which is the importance of thinking, when thinking about how we are not a homogeneous group when we're thinking about the community. And this brings in the importance of the integration of all voices equally, not just thinking about women or young people, or also when you talk about even children and adolescents and non-binary and vulnerable communities that are, the climate change increases and its impact is very disproportionate, and their voices needs to be not, I don't like to say at the table, but we really, and also coming from the youth movement, we have our ways in naturally collaborating with one another and amplifying the voices and the needs as well as the solutions into the climate space. And this is what we want to bring in for COP this year.
So we are at time. Thank you so much for joining us here. And I am now going to hand over to climate reporter David Gellis. And for those of you fascinated with climate finance, he's leading Money in Action, Closing the Climate Finance Gap. Thank you again for coming.